Zoom, but I may wander around a little bit. Just pay attention to my slides more than anything. That's where the good stuff is. My name is Bryant Baker. I'm the Director of Conservation and Research at Los Padres ForestWatch. Who here has heard of Los Padres ForestWatch? Okay, good. So I don't have to explain too much who we are. I've been with the organization since 2016. I do a lot of different things. Has anyone ever been to a presentation that I've given before? I'm just curious. Oh yeah. Okay. Good. This is a good indication that you guys are all bird people, because if you were plant people, you'd say, "Oh yeah, I've seen you talk," because that's really my specialty is plants. I especially like wildfire and how plants deal with wildfire. I am not a condor expert. I'm not a bird expert. But I do a lot of GIS analysis. So I do a lot of data analysis, and my job at ForestWatch has me interact with California condor issues a lot as they relate to the Los Padres National Forest. So I thought when I was asked to give a presentation, I think the last time, which was a couple of years ago, I gave a presentation for Ventura, Audubon. It was just about the Los Padres in general and some of the threats that the Los Padres National Forest faces. And so when I was asked again a couple of months ago if I'd like to give a talk, I on the spot was just like, you know what, I should do one about condors. And I did not really have a plan in mind when I said that. So the last couple of weeks have been really interesting because I had to actually decide what am I going to tell you that is different than what you already know about California condors. This is one of the most famous birds in existence, right? And I, as I have said, am not a condor expert. So why the hell am I talking to you guys? And I think you'll learn something today, I hope. Some of you have been around longer than I have on this planet. You probably experienced a lot of the California condor recovery efforts, right, back in the 70s and the 80s and 90s. But my experience with condors, actually, I can trace back to 2005. How old do you think I am in this photo? That's me. 12? I said 12. 16? Okay, 16 is pretty close. I was about 15 years old. And if my mom and dad are watching, which I don't think they are, I am sorry. This is a trip to the Grand Canyon. It was a family trip. I was a terror on this trip because I had a new girlfriend at the time, and I really wanted to get back home to Arkansas to see her. And I loved nature at the time, and I otherwise would have been very into the Grand Canyon. It just wasn't quite the right time in my pubescent stages for me to go on this long family trip in the summer of 2005. However, one of my most vivid memories from that trip is being on the South Rim and seeing a group of people gathered around a ranger. I'd always been drawn to people who were teaching about nature. So of course I was like, okay, I see a person in what looks like a ranger outfit. I'm gonna go check that out. And this ranger was very excitedly pointing down the canyon to a group of very large black birds that were sort of circling about halfway down the canyon. And I got to look through one of those visitor scopes and see my very first California condor. I had no idea the significance of that at the time, but it is a memory that has really stuck with me. Interestingly, just today, I found this article actually from that same month in 2005 from the Los Angeles Times about how easy it was to see condors on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. This article said something like you could see up to 25 or 30 at a time, and they really like to hang out on the south rim pretty close to the visitor center. So I don't think this was a made-up memory. I am fairly confident that I do, in fact, remember seeing California condors. But as a kid from Arkansas, I never would have thought back then that in almost 20 years, I would be giving a talk about California condors to a group of people in some place in California. Never would have thought that. In sort of preparing for this talk and just over the years, I have read some really interesting books that are now kind of, I don't want to say old, because again, some of you have been around longer than me, and I don't want to imply that 1968 is old, but it is older than me. And so to me, it's kind of an older book. And some of these books, though, are really fascinating, and they were seminal books at the time for California condor conservation efforts, and you can still learn a lot from them. Not everything is 100% accurate, but there's a lot, especially in Carl Coford's 1953 book, The California Condor, which actually was something that was published by the National Audubon Society at the time. there is a lot that you can still learn from that book, because it was essentially the only real study at the time that was looking at what were condors doing, what were the last remaining condors doing out in the wild, where were they, what were their behaviors. And so a lot of what we know about condors comes from that research in the first half of the 20th century. There's some other really good books. I highly recommend, if you're able to get your hands on these, to check them out. They're fascinating, and not everything is 100% accurate, but it is pretty close and is really, really interesting. And they're a great kind of glimpse into the thought process at the time among conservationists. Now, I am not going to talk very much about that period of time from like the 70s through the 90s, which was the real condor recovery efforts by the Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies and organizations. I cannot tell that story as well as a lot of people who are still actively working on those things, who are still alive. And I think that story has been told many, many times in different ways. I don't bring anything new to that story, so I don't really want to get into that much. But I will say, if you want to read a very interesting book about that period, about how condors were saved from the brink of extinction and how they were, the captive breeding program started, and what were some of the early problems with the captive breeding program and re-releasing them into the wild, I would check out this book, Return of the Condor. We actually sell this in our store, our online store at ForestWatch. So if you go to store.forestwatch.org, you can easily get this book and other condor-related books. This is a really, really interesting book, and I think it gives great insight into how this amazing conservation effort happened and saved this species, this iconic species, from truly going extinct back in the mid-century. So I'm going to start a little bit early, and then I'm going to work my way up to that point. And I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to go kind of to modern day, what condors are doing now. And as with all good stories, this one starts with an asteroid. About 66 million years ago, not quite 65 million years ago. The thought now is actually about 66 million years ago. Has anyone ever heard of this asteroid that hit the Earth and caused some problems? Yeah, so when the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct, we always, that's what you learn in school. That's what I learned, is the dinosaurs went extinct. And of course, now I imagine there's some better language being used, like, well, it's the non-avian dinosaurs that went extinct. Some dinosaurs actually persisted. And at least a few species of avian dinosaurs made it through those trying times, so to speak. And at least one species went on to evolve into the entire Neo-Aves group, which is a massive group of birds. And if we look at 61 million years ago, you can see that there is this branch that occurred. And in one direction went the hawks and the secretary birds and some other cool, but who in here's a taxonomist? Anyone? What's this one? Ospreys, that's right, osprey. And then this other direction, which is where we're going to go, we're going to follow this branch. The cathartids started to evolve. These were the New World vultures. And at the time, during the Eocene especially, you had the rise of mammals, and especially large mammals. And anytime you've got large mammals on the landscape, you've got dead large mammals on the landscape. And if you've got dead large mammals on the landscape, you've got scavenging creatures like vultures. So there was a lot of speciation that happened over this very long period of time, several millions of years. And at about 17 million years ago, you see this branch. In one direction goes the Cathartes group. So that is a genus that today includes turkey vultures. In another direction went the Andean condors genus, the vulture, and gymnogyps, which is, of course, where California condor is placed today. And they split from one another about 10.5 million years ago. Gymnogyps, that genus actually was pretty diverse in the Pleistocene. There were a lot of different gymnogyps, some that were bigger, if you can imagine, bigger than the California condor. And the California condor is the only one, though, that persisted into the modern era, into the Holocene. And there's some fascinating paleo research that has been going on for the last couple of decades that have really given insight into how the California condor may have evolved more recently than you would think, like within the last 9,000 years even. Now, this is more of a timeline about human interactions with condors. I put this together and spent quite a while actually animating this. This was going to be a very cool animation. Same with the last slide. But when I was practicing this presentation earlier today, I realized that I was going to be speaking for like 3 hours if I didn't pare this down a little bit. So first thing I had to do was get rid of some of these long animations. But I want to just focus on a couple of sort of key periods. The first being that condors were coexisting with humans for up to 23,000 years, with Paleo-Indians and later Native Americans that were on the continent and in its range. And we know that humans were interacting with condors. They were incorporating condors into their mythology. They were utilizing condors as part of ceremonial purposes. And there's a really fascinating history there, not one that I'm going to be able to do any justice, and I'm not going to talk about it more than this right here, because I really want to focus on this period of decline that happened afterward. But my overarching point here is that for many thousands of years, condors were not going extinct, and humans were still in the landscape. Now, in 1602, the first non-indigenous folks, they were Spanish people that were on an expedition up the coast, not really getting out of their boats so much, more just trying to map the coastline, figure out, is this thing an island, this place we call California, or not? And in 1602, in the Monterey Bay, they actually saw condors, a lot of condors actually feeding on, I think, a whale carcass, and they noted it. And so this is our first record of non-indigenous people in the condors range actually seeing California condors. It wouldn't be for 167 years before that happened again. So there was a very long period before Europeans saw condors again. And what's really interesting is that the next time they were sighted by Europeans, it was actually as a stuffed condor in a Native American village along the Pajaro River, which feeds into the Monterey Bay. So Monterey Bay, you'll notice, is on here a couple of times. Very key place in terms of early interactions between Europeans and condors. And does anyone know what Pajaro means in Spanish? No? Somebody on Zoom is probably saying it. Bird, yes, bird. And in fact, the reason that the Spanish named this river Bird River was because of that stuffed condor that they saw at a village close to the mouth of this river. So there are interesting places where you may not realize there is a stronger connection to condors, but this is a good example. Now, I'm going to fast forward to 1805. Lewis and Clark, their expedition, they recorded coming across multiple condors along the Columbia River in Oregon. They also were killing a lot of condors along the Columbia River in Oregon because, hey, those are big birds. That seems interesting. Let's shoot them and check them out. And that's going to be a recurring theme, which I'll get to. And of course, 35 years later, we don't really have many more records of condors along the Columbia River. And so this is a theme you will see that people, especially American explorers and settlers, were seeing condors in an area, and then a few short decades later, there were no more condors in those areas. And you may think there could be something there. I wonder if humans were causing some problems at this point with condors, and you would be right. I want to skip to about 1910 is when there are very few records beyond 1910 of condors outside of Ventura, Santa Barbara, and Kern counties. So at this point, condors have been extirpated from much of their range, most of their range, that had extended all the way up to British Columbia at one point over the last couple of hundred years. And they were sort of in this area here, and that is where they would remain until they were taken out of the wild in 1987 for captive breeding, and then reintroduced into that same area some years later. Now, like I said, Carl Coford, he published the first systematic study of condors in 1953. He spent many, many years in the 30s and the 40s studying condors and talking with a lot of people that had been sort of observing condors for decades. He is a wealth of knowledge at this point, and I think a lot of what he wrote in 1953 heavily influenced every sort of subsequent conservation effort in terms of trying to save the California condor. So I can't really overstate how important Cofford was, and the Audubon Society, because they were the ones that actually published his work. I think they might have been bankrolling a lot of his work. It's not to say that there was not a lot of controversy when efforts to remove condors from the wild to start the captive breeding program. There was a lot of controversy then, actually. I'm not going to get into any of that. But again, read that book that I mentioned earlier, Return of the Condor, and you will find out that it was not so simple to remove an entire species from the wild in order to try to save them. One last thing I will say is that between the late 1800s and the mid-century, of the mid-20th century, is this precipitous decline in California condor populations. This is fairly well documented. But there was a time in the 30s where people were sort of convinced that condors were on the up and up. They were coming back. And I will never forget first coming across this article in the LA Times in 1935. I wasn't alive then, obviously. I found it recently in a digitized version. And it's this sort of glowing article about how condors are back, baby. They're doing all right. We are good to go. We implemented some protections in 1905. Seems to be doing the trick. I think it is a good lesson in that sometimes things seem like they're going really well in conservation, and things seem like they're on the up and up. And you may actually be in like an extinction vortex and you don't realize it, right? And that was happening then. And I find this kind of fascinating that only 50 years later, condor, every single condor had to be removed from the wild, the last remaining couple dozen, in order to save the species. So that brings me to this question: why did the California condor almost become extinct? This is something I think we all know. Condors almost became extinct. And when I read about condors in some article, whether it's like a Nat Geo article or a Wikipedia article, you always see the same thing, which is condors almost went extinct in the early 1900s because of, and then there's a list of things. And then the rest of the story is about how the condor was brought back from the edge of extinction, right? I really wanted to know why, like what really was going on in the 1800s and the early 1900s. Why did this species almost get wiped off the face of the earth? This is something that had happened multiple times, right? We shot California grizzlies to extinction. We had hunted passenger pigeons to extinction. This was a tale that was becoming very common at the time, but it didn't seem like it was super well understood about what actually was going on with condors. And I'm not saying that I've figured it out. Other people have also looked into this and have written about it. But I think the real answer is we know that there were a lot of things going on, and I'm going to talk about those. We don't know exactly how they all interacted and how exactly, they were affecting the species over a handful of decades when we know that their populations basically crashed. But we have some clues, and I want to talk about that. So the first thing, if you read Cofford, 1953, if you read any of those books from the mid-20th century about condors, you will see that they were really quite obsessed with poaching, with the idea that people were killing condors left and right, especially in the late 1800s, especially in the early 1900s, and that was causing a major, major impact on populations. And that is probably true. I went through the newspaper record. This is what you do when you have when you're a night owl and you like to stay up and read through old newspaper archives. I went back as far as I could go, which was about 1850, and I just was looking for any mention of California condors. And I picked out all the articles I could find of somebody saying, hey, Joe Schmo from wherever, he killed this big old condor. It was like 15 feet, from tip to tip, and he brought it in to town, and he's getting it stuffed, and he's gonna, sell it to the highest bidder. There are a lot of articles about that, and it's amazing. It's all over California. You see the same thing over and over. Some guy with a gun saw a condor, didn't even know if it was a condor at first. He just saw a big bird, and he said, "I wonder what that is. I'm going to shoot it, and I'll figure it out." And when he figured out it was a condor, hey, now he could kind of waltz into town, this condor killer, and everybody would ooh and ah, and then it would get taxidermied, and then maybe you would get to sell it to a museum, right? And this was rampant, especially in the mid to late 1800s and the early 1900s. You see article after article of condors being killed or captured. A lot of people were kind of into the idea of keeping condors as pets. They don't make great pets. They're kind of hard to keep alive, especially if you catch them when they're very young, which is often what was happening. If this doesn't give you some sense of what was going on, this is from 1904. This man, very proud of the condor that he killed down in Los Angeles County. And also, I kind of think this maybe is like Burt Reynolds, his inspiration for his famous, very similar pose, just sans condor. But yeah, wanton killing was really happening back then. And how was it impacting populations? Well, we don't know exactly how big the populations were to begin with, right? But I tallied this up. I also looked at some of those books and tried to find any mentions of specific instances where condors were killed, and those were different instances than what I was seeing in the newspaper record. And this is sort of what I came up with. And it's a lot. It's a lot of condors were killed. And if condor populations, let's say there were 150 left in the wild by 1890 or something, yeah, this had a pretty major impact, right? Not to mention that there was this obsession with collecting condor eggs, because you'd have newspaper after newspaper say you could get $1,000 per egg if you go and find yourself a condor egg. Anybody know anything interesting about condor eggs? Like why would people be so, why would they be so rare? Okay, well, they're big. That is of course of interest. You might know, how often does a female condor lay an egg? How many eggs does she lay at a time? How many eggs?
3.
One egg, maybe once every other year. That's it. And you can imagine if people are out there stealing eggs kind of indiscriminately, and they're killing condors, and they're capturing condors, you can start to see, okay, poaching really was a major issue, right? Cofford, he knew that there were at least 60 eggs in collections. And that was just in this time period here, right? No idea how many were actually out there in people's collections. I think he also found that there were 130 condor specimens that have been basically taxidermied that were in collections over this period. So yeah, a lot of condors were killed, even after the state implemented its first real protections of condors in 1905. You still see quite a few condors being killed in the newspaper record. And again, I have to stress this. The newspaper record is not like a perfect source of data, right? A lot is going to be missing from that. There are going to be condors that were shot and killed that nobody ever reported to the news. A newspaper didn't report about, right? So this is just kind of a glimpse into what was going on back then. And if you are interested in grizzlies and how the California grizzly went extinct, it's a very similar story. You will see a lot of the same thing. Now, I think grizzlies were probably hunted a little bit more specifically. They were targeted in a lot of ways. And they were also influenced, I think, more so by land use changes than condors were, but we'll get to that. Now, people had other reasons for killing condors. One, though, was really interesting. And so if you look at Dick Smith and Robert Easton's book from 1964, they talk about how basically there were these myths floating around, especially in the 1800s, about condors being these vicious creatures that are out there stealing livestock, right? And so a lot of ranchers were out there indiscriminately killing condors. They were seeing, any condors on their property. They may have been foraging along with a bunch of turkey vultures on a stillborn calf or something, and they would go in guns a-blazing because they didn't want these condors running off with their sheep, their goats, their calves, right? And you can see this in other newspaper articles in the 1800s, especially in the mid 1800s. I had to really restrain myself with how much I wanted to show, how many examples I wanted to show. But people were talking about how condors would carry off young bears. Let me be really clear about this. Condors cannot carry things. They are famous for not being able to carry things. They also do not attack living prey. They only eat things that are dead, and they cannot grip things and literally fly off with them. They can drag pieces of carcasses quite a ways from where they first start foraging, but they cannot lift things. They have trouble walking around on rocky areas because of the lack of grippiness on their feet. Another paper, 1861, they would carry off children if anywhere to be found. You can see how condors started to get this bad rap as this vicious. But I saw another one that was like, and this guy saw a condor. He flew from a cliff and it went and attacked like a hawk and it tore it to pieces in midair. It's just like, this is insane. I mean, this is not, none of this is real. But tall tales at the time were very popular in newspaper articles, and it again fed into misperceptions and misconceptions about this animal that probably led to more killing of the species. The other thing that was going on, especially in the early 1900s, 1920s, particularly, a lot of poisoning of animals. Now, ranching was the big sort of form of agriculture in California for much of the 1800s. As ranches started to go out of style a little bit and row crop agriculture started to come into style, especially in the Central Valley and the San Joaquin Valley, those kind of areas, you see that there were these big campaigns to get rid of anything that was seen as a pest that could potentially harm sort of economic output of these crops. Ground squirrels were one. If you've never seen this article from 2016 from Atlas Obscura about California drafting children into a war on squirrels. That sounds crazy, but this is actually somewhat true. That's a really interesting article. The point is, there were these instances where entire ranches, entire farms were being poisoned. They were putting out this thallium-laced grain to try to lure ground squirrels out of their burrows, and then they would start eating the grain, and they would die very quickly and often die outside of their burrows. Now, normally a ground squirrel wouldn't be a very big meal for a condor, and a condor would have to beat all the other scavengers to a small ground squirrel. But you got, 50 of them out there in a single area. That suddenly makes a little more sense for a condor to stop and start chowing down. We just don't know how much that poisoning was affecting the condors that were eating it. And even if you read 1953, Coford's book, he kind of downplays, like there's not good examples of a condor dropping dead after eating poisoned carcasses. Well, that may not have been exactly what happened. They may have been weakened. It could have been a repeated exposure became an issue. There just weren't good records at the time. And so it was downplayed a little bit more in favor of focusing more on the fact that people were shooting them out of the air, right? So that was going on. You also had big predators like coyotes. I hesitate to call a coyote like a big predator, really. They eat more manzanita berries than most predators, I would say. But they were seen as a problem for farming, for ranching especially, and for hunting. People did not like the idea that coyotes might be out there eating young deer, right? Even though they weren't really doing that in any significant amount. But there were these big campaigns to get rid of coyotes as well, through the same methods, basically, putting out poison bait, often in the form of carcasses. They would put out like strychnine-laced carcasses out all over the place in hopes that coyotes would come and eat them and die. And you have to imagine that not only were condors probably eating some of those carcasses, they were also eating the coyotes that were killed by those poison carcasses, right? Again, we don't know exactly how much this was really playing into the demise of the condor, but it probably was a significant factor. Interestingly, there was this agency called the Bureau of Biological Survey. You've probably never heard of it because it didn't last terribly long, but it was around for a couple of decades. It later became the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's what ultimately sort of evolved into the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it started under the Department of Agriculture. But their main sort of purpose back in the 20s and the 30s was to control pests and control predators. And so they were out there doing a lot of mass poisoning, and it was probably affecting condors to some extent. If you want a really sad, depressing read, check out the 1931 report of the Chief of the Bureau of Biological Surveys. Just some light reading for going right before you go to sleep. Really, really depressing, and a very good glimpse into our attitudes about large wildlife that we didn't understand, like coyotes and wolves and mountain lions. Very depressing. That's the other thing too I want to just briefly mention, is that the main food source for condors prior to colonization would have been elk, deer, right? Large mammals, marine carcasses along the coastal areas. And we came in, the Americans especially came in and did a really good job of getting rid of most of the elk and doing a number on these food webs that were very important for producing carrion that condors relied on. Of course, there was also a lot of ranching going on, so there was plenty of calf carcasses and sheep carcasses that condors were eating at the time. But again, all of this, it's starting to make sense, right? We were spraying the world with DDT, it seemed like. I just love photos like this of people any of you here like experience chasing after the DDT truck? My mom would always talk about that, and like growing up in Mississippi and Arkansas, them chasing the truck that was spraying this lovely substance to kill mosquitoes. What's interesting about DDT is that it has this metabolite called DDE, which, as it bioaccumulates in birds like condors, can cause eggshell thinning. This is, of course, how you maybe have heard of Silent Spring. This is why you've heard of the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. It was very much about this issue. It was really well known in bald eagles and other birds. I think this was 1979, this study found that it was also affecting condors, California condors, and that they were among the most sensitive birds to eggshell thinning caused by these metabolites of DDT getting into the food web. This is something we still see today, especially in coastal condor populations, like the Big Sur flock, that area up there, because those condors are still feeding on, opportunistically feeding on marine mammal carcasses that wash up. And these DDT and DDE compounds have sort of accumulated more so in marine systems. They are dropping, which is good because of our regulatory efforts to tamp down on the use of DDT. But you still see that there is some eggshell thinning happening. Again, we don't know exactly how much this was causing problems with California condors. But again, think that we have a lot of them are being killed, a lot of them are being captured, a lot of them are being poisoned perhaps. And at the same time, you may be causing eggshell thinning with DDT spraying, and that is causing recruitment failure, right? They're not able to recruit new individuals into these populations, and that could be a major issue. Another thing was microtrash, not so much of a problem these days, but was an issue, especially after reintroduction efforts. And so there was this problem of the curious birds. They would eat trash and then go and feed their chicks, and that would give the chicks the microtrash that they had eaten, but then the chicks can't regurgitate as well. And so this would all accumulate in their stomach, and then they'd have to get their stomachs cleaned out. It's just a whole mess. But there have been a lot of good efforts to try to get rid of microtrash on the landscape. Now, the big one, what's lead got to do with it? So in the late 1800s, we see a revolution in guns, and that is the development of the smokeless powder cartridge. There was a gun, specifically the Winchester Model 1894 became the most popular gun ever, basically, because it was the first that was available to the public that used the smokeless powder cartridge. And what you see is this natural sort of evolution of bullets, how bullets were made. And what you kind of end up with are these types of bullets that have these jackets, but they're not fully jacketed. They actually have this little, these are called soft points. And so you got a lead core, and then it's got lead sticking out above this copper jacket. And these are really good. Once they impact tissue, they expand quite a bit, and they cause more tissue damage, which is a great way to kill an animal faster. That's good for hunting, right? They also have this tiny little problem of fragmenting like crazy. And that has become a major issue. You can see this here. This is from an interesting study about how much fragmentation occurs in these different popular types of hunting ammunition that are lead-based. And so you can see all the little pieces that these people painstakingly collected from water barrels that they shot. Here's another example of, this is lead-based ammunition and ballistic gel on top, and this is copper ammunition. This is non-lead ammunition. So you can see very clean, not a lot of fragmentation, if any at all, lots of fragments. Now, of course, what happens is that these fragments get deposited throughout the body of an animal that then potentially could be a source of carrion for the California condor and other scavengers. It's also a source of meat for people that are hunting these animals, and that's kind of a problem. You don't want to ingest too much lead, generally. You may be wondering, how on earth would this really make such a big deal? Hunters aren't really known for going out there shooting animals and then just leaving them, right? The whole point of hunting is to harvest some meat, right? So not all animals that are shot get collected. They sometimes don't die immediately and they run off and hunters can't find them. Condors can find them sometimes. But the bigger issue probably is gut piles. So what will happen is that you'll field dress a carcass, like a deer carcass, and you will, what that means is where you shot it, where you killed it, you'll take out the guts and leave them behind. I'm not a hunter. You should ask a hunter why exactly this is a very common method. I'm sure there are good reasons for it. The problem is those gut piles are very attractive to scavengers, and they tend to be full of lead fragments. And we can see that lead poisoning from condors. This is condor mortality data from all of the flocks. So there are flocks in Arizona, Utah, Baja, and then a couple in California. Lead poisoning is still the #1 reason condors are dying. And this is from 2013 to 2022. This is just adult condors. And you have to understand too, there's a lot of missing in the wild and undetermined. A lot of that's going to be lead poisoning as well. It's just not always possible to find a dead condor and test it at the right moment, so that you can see its the lead levels in its blood. But yeah, lead poisoning, major issue. And you may be thinking, well, didn't we phase out lead ammunition in 2019 in California? We did, sort of. We phased it out of hunting, but it's still totally available for target shooting. So you can go to any gun shop and still find plenty of lead-based ammunition. It's not very well enforced. And we have seen that despite these bans, there are a couple of bans that have sort of affected the California flocks. Not really lead ammunition bans in other places, but there have been sort of voluntary lead ammo reduction efforts. None of these have worked particularly well. They have mixed success, the bans especially. This is just data from the California flocks from 2020 to 2022. This is the most recent data I have. And you can still see lead poisoning, #1 issue, right? #1 reason why condors are dying out in the wild. So we have got to figure out the lead issue. Now, I did, for some reason, I went on some hunting forums just to see what people were saying about lead-free ammunition, and especially in relation to condors. I don't necessarily recommend going through forums on the internet and reading comments, but I did see some really interesting comments that were, I don't think, necessarily representative of the entire hunting community. But it does show that there is at least a contingent within the hunting community that does not like lead ammunition bans, will probably never adopt lead-free ammo as long as someone is saying that they have to, and who just don't really care about condors. They think that they're doomed anyway. So that's kind of a problem. I was really happy to see, though, there were plenty of hunters that were actually sticking up for condors and were saying things like, we should have been banning lead ammunition a long time ago. Hunters should have been leading that effort because we know it's not good for the environment. We know it's not good for wildlife. It's not good for us who are eating the meat that we are shooting with lead. And I love this quote from some random person on the internet. You need to love the natural environment more than your lead bullets. That's as much as I'm going to talk about lead ammo bans because it's a sticky issue and I don't know what the answer is. I want to go back to Coford, 1953. This was his map of like, these are where condors are, 1935 and 1950. This is kind of their last stronghold. And you can see a lot of that is Ventura County. And I took that, digitized it. And so you can see, this is the Los Padres National Forest. So you can really see where this is in relation. In case you're wondering, we're right here. For those of you who are here in person, we're somewhere right there. And yeah, this is kind of where they were in the mid 20th century. Again, like I said, Coford, his work really helped establish some great conservation efforts. There were condor sanctuaries that were being created around this time that Coford was doing his work. Sisquot Condor Sanctuary in 1937 and the Sespe Condor Sanctuary in 1947. These were kind of the first of their kind. And the only true federal land condor sanctuaries that we have in existence today. When the species was listed as endangered, the Fish and Wildlife Service eventually designated critical habitat. And you can see that very much lines up with where Cofford was seeing most of the condor activity back in the mid-20th century. And then here are some other, I think, key pieces of protected land that have been very important for condor recovery efforts. Wilderness areas in the Los Padres National Forest, the Carrizo Plain, the Giant Sequoia National Monument, and some private lands over here, Tejon Ranch and Windwolves Preserve. And we also have the Hopper Mountain and Bitter Creek National Wildlife Refuges, which were made with the express purpose of for condor recovery efforts. And then now this is what the range looks like today because of so many reintroduction efforts in the Grand Canyon area over here in northern Arizona and southern Utah, and throughout central California and a little bit in southern California, Baja as well. There have been some reintroductions there. And most recently, the UROC teamed up with the federal government to reintroduce condors in northern California, which is really cool. I want to talk a little bit more about some data. I thought this was a pretty interesting, a pretty good quote from a show that I hope some of you have seen, one of my favorites of all time. So this is publicly available condor tracking data. You can see that condors have, most condors, when you see them, they've got this little tag. There's also a little GPS receiver there that is, or transmitter that's transmitting data that's being collected. And this is available to the public to look at. If you know where to look, I'm not going to tell you exactly where it is because it's, I don't necessarily want it out there that you can go and figure out exactly where condors are hanging out. But this is just a single year worth of points, tracking points for condors. Now, it doesn't tell us a lot. It tells us generally where they are. But what I did is I took those and I made this sort of density map, right? So this can really tell you where they're actually spending more time than other places. And so we see there's a lot of condor activity in the southern Sierra Mountains and in the Tehachapi Mountains, in the San Emilio Mountains here in Los Padres National Forest, the Sespe Condor Sanctuary, also, of course, Big Sur region and Pinnacles National Park. And you'll notice that they are kind of avoiding the Central Valley and the desert. They really like these mountainous areas. That has a lot to do with, those are where there are these good thermal updrafts, which are good for getting up high and being able to soar. And so this is where, again, Cofford, this was his historical range from 1935 to 1950. And you can see that lines up pretty well. So condors have been reintroduced into the wild, and they kind of are going back to the places where they were before they were taken out of the wild, which I think is very interesting. This is if you just look at stationary data points. This tells you a little bit about roosting, perching, potentially nesting, and you can see, again, some of these hot spots like Bitter Creek National Wildlife Refuge, the northeastern part of the southern Los Padres, and the Sespe Condor Sanctuary and Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge. And these match up, again, with where Cofford was seeing a lot of nesting and roosting, although you will notice a conspicuous lack of activity in the Machesna Mountain area, and here kind of southeast of Pinnacles. And so this is an area where condors have not really gone back in numbers to, even though those were important areas for condors prior to being removed from the wild. And what's interesting is that it wasn't until 2018 that a chick actually fledged in the wild in Santa Barbara County. So that was the first time that had happened since they had been removed from the wild. And that chick was this bird, 933. These photos that you're seeing of condors, these are by someone named Chris Trent, excellent photographer of condors, graciously letting me use some of their photos. And what's cool about this bird is that it is the offspring of a bird called AC4, one of the OG condors that was taken out of the wild back in the 80s and put into captive breeding for 20 some odd years and then reintroduced. And this bird is 44 years old, still kicking, still out there, and has had 30 offspring. This is like one of the most important individual condors in the world. And I wanted to show you, again, we're zooming back in on, this is all the condor activity from 2020. I want to show you just AC4's activity. And so you can see he really does not spend any time in the Sespe Condor Sanctuary area. His main haunt is the Sisquoc Condor Sanctuary, and he has been kind of a leader in getting condors back into that area where there are these historic nesting areas. So I can't speak highly enough of AC4. Now I want to show you a couple of really cool, very long flights These are, people really enjoy these. I really enjoy looking at these. This is a bird, condor number 811. Her name is Leluti. And this was in 2019. She flew from the Wind Wolves Preserve up here to Machesna Mountain, that area. And then the next day flew all the way across the Central Valley. You don't see this very often, but she made a cross-valley flight, went right over a bunch of oil wells and a bunch of row crop agriculture and next to Bakersfield. If you had been in Bakersfield and could see through some of that haziness, you might have been able to see Leluti flying across the sky on March 30th. And that was a 165-mile flight in just a matter of hours in a single day. These birds can soar for very long distances. It is absolutely fascinating. Leluti also kind of went viral a little bit in 2023 because she was posing for a live cam on a mountain in Kern County. You can see her here. She kind of made some news articles, and very, very cute, adorable bird. And I'm glad to see that she is still out there, still alive. Bird 828, number 828. If you thought that was impressive, this one is going to really knock your socks off. She flew from Pinnacles, woke up one morning in Pinnacles National Park and said, you know what, I'm going south. It's not even winter. I'm just going south for the hell of it. And on July 12th, flew all the way down to about the Carrizo Plains Ecological Reserve, right here, pretty close to the Carrizo Plain National Monument and Los Padres National Forest. Next day, woke up, said, I'm not done yet. Went to the Angeles National Forest, turned around, kind of went over to the Sespe Condor Sanctuary area and Sespe Wilderness. Next day, flew a little bit more, checked out AC4's hunting ground, his scavenging areas and nesting areas, and then decided that she had seen what she needed to see that month and made her journey back up north. And within just 5 days, she had flown from Pinnacles down to almost Santa Clarita and back to Pinnacles. That's pretty amazing. And what's cool is that this was 830 miles round trip, right? That's a hell of a flight. And she was hitting a lot of the key areas that Toford had noticed back in the 30s and 40s. And so she was hitting some of these key ones, again, the Sisquoc area, Sisquoc Condor Sanctuary area, and even the Machesna Mountain area. And she did it again in the next month, August. She was like, you know what? I really enjoyed that. I'm going to go back and see my new friends that I made. What is neat about Condor 828 is that she was part of the Central California flock and was going down to where the Southern California flock is really spending most of their time. This doesn't happen very often where they are sort of mixing and they're sort of seeing each other in their respective areas. She also made the news a couple of years ago for going all the way up to Mount Diablo. This is one of the most adventurous birds in any of these flocks in California. And she died last year of lead poisoning. And this is a problem, right? We have these birds that are pushing the limits of where reintroduced condor populations, experimental condor populations, where they're able to thrive. And that's what we need, in these birds, is to find these new places or old places, perhaps, where they can thrive even more. But there's not a lot of thriving if lead poisoning is still this rampant killer. And that's something we have to get a handle on. Another couple of birds I want to just mention briefly. Number 939 in 2022, she is from the southern flock, and she flew from around, I think this is Alamo Mountain, flew all the way up to Big Sur, had heard all about how nice the Big Sur coast was, and flew up there, and then came back, and then over the next couple of months, made her way to Sequoia National Park, which is pretty cool. And if you think that's interesting, well, you might be surprised to learn that condors actually were historically nesting in giant sequoias, in these big cavities. This is one of the last ones we know of in 1955, before they disappeared from that area. And that's a big cavity. They still do this in the Big Sur area in redwoods, closely related species to the giant sequoia. And fire especially creates these really nice cavities in these redwoods that condors utilize for nesting. Now, another bird, 949, I don't remember if this is, I think these were both males. He went from Giant Sequoia National Monument, that area, all the way up to Yosemite. So that's about as far north as any of the birds in the southern flock ever have gone, which is really, really something. Last thing I want to end on this, because I think this is pretty cool. I look at a lot of condor data for fun. I just find it fascinating. I cannot stop looking. And so I just sort of scroll around, and I was interested in this area because this is Sulphur Mountain. This is pretty close to Ventura. A lot of condor activity. This is in, I think, 2020. And so I see all these are stationary points. So I see clusters. That's a pretty good indication of roosting or perching. Not nesting in this area. I don't think there's any nesting going on here. But I see a lot in, some of these kind of rocky areas and then in the trees. Those all make sense. But I see these two right there. I'm like, what's going on there? Right here in this like open field. And so let's just isolate those and zoom in. And yeah, these were all occurring on the same few days in July, I think, in 2020. And when you look, it's a bunch of different birds. Anybody know what might be happening here?
Carcass?
They're feeding, they're foraging. There's something died there. And it may have been two carcasses. It may have been one carcass that started off here and part of it got dragged over here. There's definitely some foraging going on, and that's a lot of birds, a couple of which I think one for sure has died. And I'm not saying they were affected by feeding on this carcass. I don't know what kind of carcass it was. It was something. Could have been stillborn calf. It could have been deer. Could have been a wild boar. Could have been a number of things, right? But this can give you a little bit of insight into how a single poison carcass, whether it is from lead ammunition or from strychnine or phthalate or whatever was being used to bait coyotes and other animals back in the day, you can see how that can very quickly affect a lot of condors at one single time, right? All of these condors fed within basically a week of each other in this on this carcass. This is really interesting. And you can see, actually, this is cool. This is imagery from right after that. You can see there's these two big spots. That's probably from where the carcass had decomposed and where there was all this activity. Pretty fascinating. This is what it would have looked like. There's our buddy, 933, the first wild-fledged chick from Santa Barbara County. This is, I think, in Bitter Creek National Wildlife Refuge, but there he is, hanging out with some other birds feeding on a calf. That's where I'm going to end it. I went